From Yucatan to Tijuana, with Sinaloa and Michoacan in between, Mexico has plunged into a new spiral of tension. And no, this time we are not just talking about organized crime. The pressure is coming from thousands of young people who have taken to the streets to protest against a government that cannot meet even their most basic demands. In today's video, we are going to answer 3 essential questions about Mexico. What is happening in the country right now? When did these problems begin? And why has the youth decided to rise up? As always, we need to understand the past first, because the issues we are seeing today did not appear overnight, they did not start with this government, and not even with the one before it. They are the result of decades marked by inequality, violence, corruption, and deep institutional crises. To understand why Mexico is experiencing this level of social unrest, we need to look back. On paper, Mexico is one of the most stable democracies in the world. Since 1930, every president has completed their 6-year term. The country has avoided military coups, and the 1917 Constitution has remained in force for more than a century. Compared with other countries in the region, Mexico shows an institutional continuity that is extremely rare in Latin America. But of course, it is very easy to look stable when a single party dominates your country for 70 years. Yes, between 1930 and 2000, Mexico was governed by the same political force, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, better known as the PRY. It controlled practically everything: the presidency, the governors, Congress, the unions, and a good part of the media. And that total control had a very clear origin. After the Mexican Revolution, the goal of the new National Revolutionary Party was to unify the country and prevent it from falling back into the fragmentation of the past. To achieve that, the state concentrated power in the presidency and built a corporatist system that absorbed farmers, workers, and popular sectors into the party itself, reducing the influence of the military to the bare minimum. Something very different from what happened across the rest of the continent. That model created stability and fueled decades of economic growth, especially between 1940 and 1970. During the so-called Mexican miracle, the problem was that the benefits concentrated in certain regions and sectors, while millions of people remained stuck in the informal economy with low wages and weak public services. It also strengthened clientelist networks. In Mexico, if you wanted to do business, it was almost expected that you would have to go through a corrupt politician and pay your way. The problem is that on top of this rotten structure of corruption, in which even the army and the police were involved, something else was added: violence. In 2006, the government of Felipe Calderón declared war on drug trafficking, and the country changed almost instantly. Homicides shot up, the cartels fractured into dozens of groups, and violence stopped being a contained phenomenon to become part of the daily life of millions of people. Since then, Mexico has lived with a chronic level of insecurity that no government from any party has been able to stop. With the arrival of new administrations from the PAN, then the PRI again, and more recently Morena, expectations shifted but the problems remained. Every government promised a fresh start, yet Mexicans kept facing the same reality: a country that simply does not guarantee them a safe future. Everything I've explained so far is deeply tied to the current crisis. To understand it better, we're going to step into the mind of a young Mexican and try to answer one of the key questions from the beginning of this video. Why has the youth decided to take to the streets? As you can probably guess from everything we've explained, the first major cause is insecurity. For almost 20 years, Mexico has lived with a level of violence that simply shouldn't exist in times of peace. Since 2006, the country has recorded more than 430,000 homicides and over 100,000 missing people. For a generation that has grown up watching news of massacres, towns controlled by criminal groups, and entire municipalities where the state barely exists, violence isn't an abstract idea, it's part of everyday life. Many young people feel that the state cannot protect them, and that their safety depends more on luck than on the institutions meant to defend them. On top of that comes a second structural cause: economic inequality. Mexico is one of the largest economies in Latin America, yet also one of the most unequal. Around 30% of the population lives in poverty, and the richest 10% controls 60% of the country's wealth. This means that while part of the population enjoys a lifestyle similar to that of a developed country, millions of others lack basic services, quality healthcare, or a stable job. The labor market is another source of frustration. 1 out of every 3 young people works in the informal economy, with no contract, no social security, and wages that barely cover the most basic expenses. Even those who study and earn university degrees run into a tough reality: low-paid jobs, overqualification, and a level of competition that doesn't guarantee any real social mobility. This creates a feeling of long-term stagnation, the sense that no matter how hard you work, the future doesn't really get better. Housing is another critical issue. Buying a house or an apartment has become practically impossible for the average young person. Prices have risen far faster than salaries, especially in big cities like Mexico City, Guadalajara, or Monterrey. Renting isn't much easier. Prices keep climbing. Landlords demand strict guarantees and affordable options are scarce. There is also the issue of corruption and impunity, a combination that makes young people trust the system very little. More than 90% of crimes in Mexico go unreported or uninvestigated, and of those that are investigated, very few end in a conviction. In other words, most Mexicans feel that justice is basically a joke. And of course, if institutions don't punish abuse, what does it matter that they exist? Another factor is the militarization of public life. Since the beginning of the war, the armed forces have taken on responsibilities that used to belong to civilian institutions. And yes, because of the power of the cartels, the state needs to strengthen its presence. But many young people feel that the country is getting used to a militarized model where civilians have less and less control over security. Another key factor is the accumulated distrust toward the political class. In recent years, Mexico has had governments from every part of the political spectrum. All of them promised deep transformative change. But in practice, for millions of young people, nothing has really changed. On top of all these structural issues, there was a specific event that struck a nerve across the country. The mayor of Uruapan, Carlos Manso, was shot dead during a public event right in the middle of the city. This reinforced the idea that not even the authorities are safe, and it fed an even stronger sense of chaos and insecurity throughout Mexico. And finally, there is a major generational factor. Today's young Mexicans have grown up hyper-connected. They see how young people live in other countries. They compare salaries, safety, social mobility, and life opportunities. As we've seen in other Gen Z protests around the world, social media has shortened the patience threshold. Expectations are higher, demands are more immediate, and when authorities don't respond, frustration spreads quickly. Mexico heats up and suddenly, the youth take to the streets waving the One Piece flag. And that is exactly what has happened. Youth protests, teachers' protests, and union protests have erupted in response to economic frustration and to a government that seems increasingly defensive. The most visible demonstrations are those led by young people who identify as the Mexican Gen Z. Through TikTok, X, and other platforms, calls to march began to spread across the country with messages like "Recall the mandate," "No more corruption," or "We want safety." Within days, hundreds of different accounts were repeating the same slogans, some long established, others brand new. This caught the government's attention immediately, and it responded by launching unusually large security deployments. This wave of youth discontent is colliding with other social conflicts. One of the biggest is a dispute that has been growing quietly for years: the battle over water. The official goal is to regain control of a resource that is, in large part, managed by private interests. But for thousands of farmers, this reform would mean losing the ability to inherit or sell their land, because without a water concession, those plots are worth nothing. That is why agricultural organizations have risen up against the proposal. They have already blocked highways in at least 20 states and are now threatening to shut down border customs. And on top of that, you have the actions of the National Coordinator of Education Workers, the CNTE. Teachers have launched strikes and marches in Mexico City and even warned that they could surround the National Palace, for now the government is not offering any meaningful response to these movements. Meanwhile, Scheinbaum has questioned the authenticity of the youth protests. In the days leading up to the first demonstrations, the government released a report claiming that the mobilization did not emerge spontaneously. According to the report, the movement was amplified by a coordinated strategy involving linked accounts, influencers, and profiles connected to the international right. The document estimates more than 90 million pesos spent on digital campaigns over a month and a half, and notes that over 100 newly created TikTok accounts and hundreds of Facebook groups promoted the protests in a very short time span, something quite unusual. Most of the influential accounts associated with Gen Z deny having received any funding and accuse the government of trying to delegitimize a protest that, in their view, is driven by sheer exhaustion, insecurity, corruption, and a lack of opportunities. There is also a part of Gen Z that criticizes possible activists backed by the opposition. On social media, the Gen Z movement itself has begun organizing in an open and horizontal way, and its echoes are already being heard around the world. In short, to understand what is happening in Mexico, we need to be clear about something. The youth protests are not appearing out of nowhere. Across the country, there are many groups worn out by decades of corruption, mismanagement, inequality, and insecurity. Mexico is dealing with several overlapping crises, and that explains why any spark, a youth march, an assassination, or a legislative reform can set the country on edge. The big question now is whether this Gen Z movement will end up being captured by a particular political ideology, or whether it can genuinely become a broad, cross-cutting movement that brings together very different perspectives. For now, neither the Mexican left nor the Mexican right has managed to claim the energy of this new generation. And now the key question: what is the most likely scenario from here on out? Do you support the Mexican protesters? See you in the comments. That's all for today's video. You know the drill. If you enjoyed the story, give it a like, hit subscribe, and dive in for the next one.